If you're trying to conceive and quietly wondering if life can be whole without a baby, feeling anxious, uncertain, or weary in your faith, you're not alone. Welcome to the Infertility and Trying to Conceive podcast for Christian women. I'm Linda Renee, an Aussie wife, mum, and follower of Jesus. Here I share biblical truth, simple conception tips, offer emotional support, and have honest conversations about what struggling to conceive really looks like as a Christian woman. My prayer is that this podcast lightens your load, keeps you anchored in Christ, and helps you move forward with confidence, peace, and hope. Christ goes before you, and I'm right here helping you look to Him every step of the way. Let's begin. I'm super appreciative that you've been able to join me. Today I do want to talk about your husband, what might actually be going on for him through all of this. Because I'm guessing that some of these thoughts may have crossed your mind. Thoughts like, why doesn't he seem as upset as I am with all of this? Why can he just go to work like everything's normal? Why doesn't he want to talk about this anymore? Does he even feel this the way I do? When you're going through infertility, much of this experience centers on you. Your body and your grief and your fear. And that's really understandable because your body is carrying most of the weight of this physically. And that's just the reality of it. But without meaning to, I think an assumption that can spring up in our minds is that he's fine. If he's not visibly falling apart, he must be carrying less. And when he goes quiet or wants to change the subject or can somehow watch TV while you're barely holding it together, those thoughts can develop into something that just sits in the back of your mind and that can really eat you away. So today I want to gently pull the curtain back on that because I think understanding what might be going on for your husband could change everything about how you move through this season together. So let's get into it. So maybe you've had a moment like this. You're lying in bed after an appointment. You're replaying every detail, the doctor's tone, the results, the next steps, the timeline. And he rolls over and says, let's just see what happens. Or maybe it's, we'll figure it out. And something inside you tightens because you're thinking, how can you just say that? How can you just switch off? I remember sitting in the car after one of our appointments, feeling like I was completely spiraling internally. I wanted to go over every detail and wanted to talk through every fear. And Brad just seemed removed from it all. I remember thinking, we are just not in the same place right now. But later on, I came across research that really helped me understand that moment differently. In 2006, a study was published in a journal called Human Reproduction with real clinical research. Researchers followed couples going through fertility treatment, and they were looking at how men and women cope differently with infertility stress. And here's what they found. Guys most often coped by distancing, stepping back emotionally from the intensity of it, sometimes even making light of it. They kept their feelings to themselves and they tried not to let those feelings interfere with their daily life. They focused on problem solving. What's the next step? What can be researched and what can be done? Whereas women, they were more likely to seek emotional support and process out loud, talk to people and revisit what's happening with them internally and emotionally and what all that means. And neither of these ways of reacting or responding to infertility, they're not wrong. They're just different. Here's the thing though, if you're processing out loud and your husband is processing internally and you don't know for certain what's going on for him, you can start building a story about him that might not be quite accurate. You can start thinking if he really cared, he'd want to talk about this. If he really was impacted or upset by this, he wouldn't just be able to switch off, surely. And this feels true, but it's worth considering that it might not be the whole picture. Different ways of coping doesn't mean that you care less about things. It means that you just have different wiring, different ways of approaching things. And the research also showed that when couples worked through things together and actually supported each other, they felt closer and more connected. But when both of them shut down and stopped talking, the distance between them grew over time. So this isn't about whose way is better. It's about understanding each other well enough to actually reach each other. James 1 tells us to be quick to listen, slow to speak, slow to become angry. And I know that can feel almost impossible when you feel unseen. But if your husband copes differently to how you do, it doesn't mean that he doesn't love you. It just may simply mean that the way he survives hard things looks different to how you do. And underneath all of that, there's something else worth touching on, something that rarely gets said. A lot of men, whether they say it or not, tie a big part of their identity to being able to provide, to protect, to fix things, to be strong enough for the people they love. So when infertility happens, this problem that can't be resolved by working harder or planning more carefully or being more capable, it quietly attacks that identity. And if your husband has been told that there's a problem with his fertility, that his sperm count is low, or that something's going on with his side of things, that layer gets even heavier, because suddenly it's not just a shared problem you're both facing. It's his body, his sense of self as a man. And that's a lot to sit with, even when he never says a word about it. He likely won't say out loud that he feels inadequate, or that he feels like he lets you down, or that he feels exposed. But it can be sitting right there underneath the surface, showing up as withdrawing from you, or working long hours, or irritation, or even just this flat kind of cheerfulness that doesn't quite reach his eyes. I actually have a name for it when Brad does this, and I call it he goes into his internal man cave. He goes in there, he processes in silence, and he switches off from things, including me, until he's ready to face the world again. And I think we see this pattern occur in Genesis 3 after the fall. The first thing Adam and Eve did was hide. They felt exposed and ashamed, and they covered themselves and retreated. Shame doesn't just make women hide, it makes men hide too. And the thing is that we live in a world where men are largely not given much space to fall apart. There's not a lot of room in most men's lives for saying, I'm really struggling with this. I do think Christians can potentially do a better job with this, and having accountability partners and things like that. But generally, it's not what men are taught in our society. It's not what they've seen modelled. And a lot of guys genuinely don't have the language for it, or they don't know what to do with the feeling, even if they can name it. So instead of saying to you, I'm really upset, he says, it'll be fine. Or instead of saying, I feel helpless, he starts looking to the next thing, a new plan, a different approach, something he can actually do. And instead of saying, I'm scared of what this is doing to us, he might even, go really quiet or pull back or shrink into himself in ways that are hard to reach. And that silence, that pulling back, it isn't him necessarily being checked out. A lot of the time, it's someone who is actually very much checked in, but who has no idea what to do with what he's feeling. And that leads me to one of the most painful dynamics I hear about. You need to talk about it a lot, because processing out loud is a common way that women cope. But he pulls back from those conversations because stepping away from the intensity may be how he copes. And when he wants to go to dinner with friends or laughs at something on his phone, you might actually feel like, you might feel something close to betrayal. This thinking that, how can you even do that when I can barely breathe here? And when you're the one whose body is at the center of all this, the appointments, the medications, the procedures, the constant monitoring, that reaction is understandable. I get it. But it can be worth considering that for a lot of guys, taking a break from the weight of infertility isn't just about not caring. It's about how they regulate, and it's how they refill enough to keep showing up. If infertility becomes the only topic in your marriage, if there's no space that isn't heavy, some men might start to feel like they're failing every single day, like there's no safe ground anywhere, like the whole relationship has been swallowed by one painful, unresolved problem. And when that happens, they don't tend to engage more, they tend to disengage more. Your need to process out loud is completely real and legitimate, but it may be worth sitting with the idea that his pulling back may have less to do with your pain and more to do with how he's managing his own. And some men, especially if your marriage was in a really good place before all of this, they might just be grieving what you had together in the past. He might be thinking, I just want my wife back, because your world has become consumed with trying to conceive. And if you add, treatment cycles and hormone injections on top of that, he might just feel like he doesn't quite recognize you anymore. And that's a real loss for him. He might even resent what this season has done to your relationship. Not because he doesn't want a baby, but because he's watching something that he loved turned into a place of pain. Ecclesiastes says there's a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance. Some men go looking for the lighter moments, not because the grief isn't real, but because they genuinely can't sustain themselves on grief alone. Very few of us actually can. And something that I had to face myself is that infertility, it can bring out a really strong urge to take control. When everything feels uncertain and out of your hands, it's really natural to start gripping tightly to what you can control. The decisions that you make, or the timelines that you want things to happen in, or the way conversations go, I did this, and so I understand why we do it. But Genesis 3, I think, can help us make sense of what happened to marriage after the fall. Part of what God describes is this pull in women towards wanting to dominate the relationship. Not because you want to hurt your husband, but it's because you do so out of fear. That fear of losing control, of the outcome being taken out of your hands and being left with nothing. And I had moments in our fertility journey where I genuinely thought, you know what, I'm the one dealing with the brunt of this, so my opinion should matter more. And I understand that instinct. Your body does carry most of this. That is real. But your marriage is one flesh also. You're a team, you're bound together, and this belongs to both of you. Philippians 2 calls us to have the mind of Christ, the one who didn't grasp for control, who humbled himself and who put others above himself. And that can be a really hard thing to do in a season this raw right now. But here's why it matters specifically for your husband. If he constantly feels overruled, if he feels like a passenger, something that's entirely centered on your body and your grief, it's highly possible that he will gradually stop trying to engage with you. That can happen slowly and quietly, but by the time you notice, a lot of distance might have already built up between you both. One of the ways that distance grows in a marriage during infertility is when the longing for a baby becomes bigger than the marriage itself. And that's what leads into this next shift. When Brad and I were in the thick of infertility, I didn't do this well, I must admit. Looking back, I can see how much I reduced him, not intentionally, but I did do it. He told me that in his mind he felt like I saw him as a means to an end, like I wanted him for what he could give me and not for who he actually was. Brad had a job that he loved, he had hobbies and friendships, things outside of us that gave him a sense of purpose. And I looked at all of that and told myself a story, that he would be okay either way, that he didn't care as much as I did, that because he had other things in his life, a baby just wasn't the same kind of need for him as it was for me. And he never actually said these things to me, yet I decided that that's what he thought. And once I decided it, I started to feel completely alone. Like I was the only one in our marriage who truly wanted this. Like I'd spend the rest of my life feeling lonely and purposeless while he was just, while he got on with things. And that loneliness turned into resentment. And the thing is, I never asked him what he thought. I just assumed. And that assumption pushed us further away from each other rather than closer together in a hard time that we were going through. That thinking shaped how I saw him and how I treated him. It sidelined him and put him in our story that I'd had made all about me and what I needed. And that's a really painful thing to admit. If I could go back, one of the things that I'd say to myself, and I'm saying it to you as well, is this. Tell him you want him more than you want a baby. I know that might be genuinely hard to say, and I know it might be hard to fully mean it on some days, especially when the longing is so raw. But I think that sentence matters so much to a guy who may be quietly wondering whether he's already been replaced in your heart by someone who doesn't even exist yet. Before Adam and Eve had children, God looked at their marriage, just the two of them, and called it very good. Not good in a temporary, holding pattern, waiting for the better thing to come along kind of way. But he called it very good right then as a marriage. God made marriage to mean something on its own. It's a real commitment. It's bound together. And he said it was very good before any children were ever in the picture. You and your husband are already a family. And that's not just something said to make you feel okay about your situation. It's something that is simply true. So what does this actually look like day to day? Understanding all of this is one thing, but you still have to go home, live in the same house, have hard conversations, navigate decisions, and grieve and hope and fall apart at times, often all in the same week. So I have a few practical suggestions of things that you can do. Ask your husband how he's doing, not during a fight or at the end of an exhausting day, but in a calm or somewhat relaxed moment. Ask him something like, what has this actually been like for you? And genuinely mean it. That question does something. It tells him that you're on his side, not just asking him to perform some sort of emotional response for you, and then actually sit with whatever he comes back with, even if the answer is short, even if it's, I don't know. Some guys need to be asked more than once before they find the words, and that's okay. Thank him specifically as well. Not just a general thank you, but thank you for driving me to that appointment. Thank you for holding my hand through that procedure. Thank you for not making me pretend to be okay last night. I see how hard you're trying, even when I don't say it. Guys who feel unseen tend to pull back further, but guys who feel genuinely seen tend to lean in closer to you. Also, give him some room to be involved. Ask him his thoughts about treatments or procedures. Let him weigh in on decisions rather than just being told what's happening. It can be tempting to avoid asking his opinion if you're scared that his opinion will clash with yours, and I may do an episode on how to navigate this in the future. But the research actually shows that when guys felt actively involved in the journey rather than standing on the outside watching, they felt more purposeful, and both partners felt more connected. And that sometimes makes a huge difference for your relationship and your sanity. And where you can, try to protect some space in your week that has nothing to do with fertility. Even just one evening, go for a walk, get dinner, watch something you both actually like on TV. Your relationship has more in it than just this one season, and it needs a bit of room to remember that. And the last thing, pray together. Even if it's just short, it doesn't have to be long or fancy. Even just, Lord, help us to trust you. Something simple and honest that puts you both on the same side. And if your marriage is so tense right now that every conversation feels like it's one wrong word away from a blow up, that's maybe a sign that you need someone else in the room. A counsellor, a pastor, someone you both trust enough to sit with. Proverbs talks about the wisdom of seeking counsel, and this is likely that kind of situation. But underneath all of that, the deepest source of strength for your marriage is Christ. Paul said, "When I am weak, then I am strong." And I think what that actually looks like a lot of the time is just getting to the end of yourself and finally holding your hands open, saying, "I can't hold this." And that's actually where God meets you. There's no shame in being in that place. That's kind of the whole point. So here's where I want to land. This episode has been about your husband, what he might be carrying, why he copes the way he does, and what he might need from you. And I hope it's given you a different way to see him. But here's the thing. Even if you understand him perfectly, from this point on, even if he grieves exactly the way that you need him to and says all the right things and shows up perfectly, it still won't fill what you're actually longing for. He was never meant to carry that. That's not a criticism of him. It's just not what he was designed for. Only Christ is. And that goes for both of you. Christ sees your tears. Psalm 58:6 says he keeps track of every single one. But he also sees your husband, the guy who keeps showing up even when he doesn't know what to say, the stuff he's carrying that he's never found words for. God doesn't measure who's suffering more based on who's talking the most about it or who's crying the loudest. He sees what's hidden, and he's not removed from any of this painful situation. And because he sees both of you, he's the one worth fixing your eyes on. Hebrews 12 tells us to fix our eyes on Jesus, the one who went through suffering without being bitter, who kept trusting the Father even in the hardest parts of it, who just kept going. And if he could do that, he understands what you're carrying. He's not watching from a distance. He's the one you fix your eyes on, not whether your husband grieves the way you need him to, not a perfect conversation, not an outcome you're hoping for, just him, who doesn't change, whose love for you has nothing to do with your fertility, and whose hold on you doesn't give way. If this episode stirred something in you, maybe some conviction, maybe a bit of tenderness towards your husband, maybe just noticing that some distance has crept in and that you didn't even realize, don't let it turn to shame. Let that just be a starting point. Maybe you just start with a small sentence, just saying to your husband, "I've just been thinking about how all of this may have been for you." And that can be it, that one sentence, that small move towards him. It can open something. This chapter will end. It won't last forever. And it isn't always easy to hear that, especially if it doesn't pan out the way that you hope it will. But right now, you do have your marriage. And the work you're doing right now, just by thinking about him, by wanting to understand him better, by being willing to look at your own part in this, that's not nothing. The way you choose to move towards each other in this season, that can shape what your marriage looks like on the other side of it. I'll drop the study details into the show notes if you want to have a look at that. So take care of yourself and take care of your husband, and I'll see you next time. Before you go, thank you so much for listening. I pray today's episode has brought you fresh hope for whatever comes next. If someone comes to mind today who could truly use support in this space, please share this episode or the podcast with them. It might be exactly what they need. And if you could take 30 seconds to give me a star rating or leave 1 or 2 sentences about what this podcast has meant to you on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, I'd be ever so grateful. Your feedback not only helps others find the podcast, but it truly makes my day. And words of affirmation are my love language. And if you're not sure how to do that, I'll pop the links in the show notes below. Lastly, although I do have a nursing degree, everything shared in this podcast is for inspiration and education only. Please don't use it as a replacement for advice from your personal, medical or mental health professional. There's absolutely no shame in getting additional support when you need it, but always consult your expert team before making any changes to your fertility journey. That's all from me today. Take care, and I'll catch you next time. Bye.